Good morning to our viewers here in the United States, and good afternoon to our viewers in Europe. I'm joined today by nuclear non-proliferation expert Kelsey Davenport and Iran expert Dr. Cornelius Adebahr. Kelsey is the Director for Non-Proliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association, where she focuses on the nuclear and missile programs in Iran, North Korea, India, and Pakistan, and also on international efforts to prevent non-proliferation and nuclear terrorism. In addition, she reports on developments in these areas for Arms Control Today. Kelsey, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And Cornelius is a frequent guest at ACG events and has visited a number of our chapters across the US. He is a non-resident fellow at Carnegie Europe and also runs his own political consultancy in Berlin. His research focuses on foreign and security policy with a special focus on Iran and the Persian Gulf, and also on European and transatlantic affairs. His most recent book is Europe and Iran, the Nuclear Deal and Beyond. Herzlich willkommen.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to be back. Thanks for having me.
So when we were in touch with each other to set up today's discussion about the United States, Europe, and Iran, we knew the event would be timely, but it assumes an even greater urgency in light of yesterday's airstrikes in eastern Syria against Iran-backed militias responsible for recent attacks against American and allied personnel in Iraq. A proxy conflict between the United States and Iran has been playing out in Iraq and elsewhere, and these retaliatory strikes come as both countries are trying to find a way to return to the negotiating table to talk about the Iran nuclear deal. In a major step for the United States, late last week, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and the foreign ministers of France, Germany, and the United Kingdom issued a joint statement indicating that they are willing to hold direct talks with Tehran over how to bring the United States and Iran into compliance with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, which is commonly known as the Iran nuclear deal. Cornelius, do you think that yesterday's airstrikes and the simmering proxy conflict between the US and Iran will stand in the way of these negotiations and reinvigorated diplomacy when it comes to the Iran nuclear deal?
Thank you, Steve. That's a very pertinent question right from the beginning. Let me answer with a short no. I don't think this will stand in the way, and let me explain why I can be so clear on this. If anything, I mean, there has been regional rivalry around Iran, and also with a role for the United States to play for the past 3-4 decades. And there was also intense regional rivalry during the negotiations that had led to the JCPOA in the first place. And the recipe for success then was to compartmentalize the issues, to say we can talk about and possibly agree on the nuclear file, and then we still disagree and have adversarial actions on other issues. And so, if anything, I would say the airstrike, which was a response to an attack by Iranian-supported militias in Iraq, this is a tit-for-tat measure. It shows that the new US president doesn't want to be pushed around, and that he should be taken as his word, hopefully also at his word when it comes to the nuclear file.
Thank you. Kelsey, I'm guessing, since you were nodding, that you see it similarly, that this was really a tit-for-tat measure, as Cornelius described it, and won't have a major impact on the negotiations.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And as Cornelius noted, I mean, there's a history of being able to compartmentalize the nuclear file from other regional activities when negotiations on the original nuclear deal were ongoing. But for me, one thing that I think is important to underscore, in light of this strike, is the importance of moving quickly to restore the nuclear deal. Because every regional conflict, every regional tension becomes more complicated, becomes more difficult, becomes more concerning if there's an unrestrained Iranian nuclear program, an unrestrained Iranian nuclear threat kind of hanging over the region. So for me, the pathway to regional security dialogue to stabilize some of these situations has to run through first restoring the JCPOA, restoring U.S. credibility in negotiations, and then kind of setting the table, for a range of other talks.
So I'd like to definitely come back to some of the regional instability during the course of our conversation, because I think that there's a lot there to unpack. But before we do that, I'd like to maybe drill down on the timing issue that you were just touching on, Kelsey. This is incredibly time sensitive at this point. According to some reports, Tehran may be only months away from amassing enough fissile material to build an atomic bomb. And yet, there seem to be some hurdles to bringing both parties back to the table and into compliance. Kelsey, you've obviously been following this closely, particularly in your role as the lead author of P4+1 and the Iran Nuclear Deal newsletter, which assesses developments related to the agreement. I guess, what are your concerns about where we are right now, about the timing, but also about how monitoring might proceed?
I think the timing is critical, and the window to restore the nuclear deal really is closing. And I think that for a few reasons. First, if we look at some of the early actions that Iran took to violate its commitments under the nuclear deal, the early ones in 2019, throughout 2020, most of these actions were activities that Iran had undertaken prior to negotiations on the nuclear deals. And they were very carefully calibrated to indicate Iran's dissatisfaction with the fact that sanctions relief had dried up under the agreement, but without sort of pushing any buttons that might cause the Europeans, say, to want to pull out of the deal or to take sort of punitive actions. So these were very carefully calibrated actions designed to increase Iran's leverage. They clearly weren't about dashing for a bomb. They kept open the space for diplomacy. But in recent months, after Iran passed the law in December 2020, mandating that Tehran take certain steps in violation of the deal over this next year, these activities are more serious and they're more difficult to reverse. You mentioned monitoring. That's a particularly serious concern because just this week, Iran suspended some of the more intrusive monitoring and verification measures required by the JCPOA. Now, inspectors will still have access to monitor Iran's production of fissile material and its storage of fissile material. But some of the related access, inspecting sites where activities are undertaken that support Iran's nuclear program, for instance, all of those have been suspended. Now, there is a 3-month agreement that will provide the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is, of course, in charge of monitoring and verification, with information that Iran collects during this next 3 months. And they'll hand that over to the IAEA at the end of the time period if the nuclear deal is restored. So that will give the IAEA the ability to kind of reconstruct Iran's nuclear history throughout this 3 months. But certainly, this agreement staves off a crisis, but it's not ideal. And any loss of monitoring and verification is going to just increase the speculation that Iran is engaged in illicit activities. So I think it's imperative to use this next 3 months before Iran, takes further steps that are more difficult to reverse and really complicate the ability to fully restore the benefits of the JCPOA.
Thank you. Cornelius, in some of your commentary, you've also been focusing on sort of the sigh of relief that many people breathe because of this 3-month agreement and the fact that the IAEA will have some access to information about what Iran is doing. To what degree do you share Kelsey's concerns, or do you think that the situation is perhaps even more severe or drastic?
I think the assessment of Kelsey is to the point. What one could add is that it is very much disputed inside Iran these days. The reason why we are in this situation very much has to do with I'd say the political calendar in Iran. I mean, we knew already that Iranians will elect a new president by the summer, by June 18. And, you know, reason suggests that one would have to come to some sort of an agreement besides the actual nuclear issue, the inspections and the amassment of nuclear fissile material, but to come to an agreement before that election. So that was the window was already short between the inauguration of President Biden and the election in Iran. Now the Iranian parliament intervened and put out a deadline for some movement by the United States on sanctions relief, which expired earlier this week, and which is why this kind of frenzy with the IAEA occurred, because otherwise the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, would not have had these kind of supervision rights. So this is the domestic debate which exists in Iran. It's obviously it's not a democracy as we conceive it, but nonetheless there are different political camps. There is public opinion. There is an election coming up, as I said. So this is not nothing. And politicians in Iran have now come against the agreement, saying this is not what Parliament wanted. So this debate will continue probably. And at the same time, just one point on the United States, everyone is aware that there are still Senate confirmations going on. That may be one reason why the US administration has not been so forthcoming as people would have wanted them to be. So these political dynamics very much play into the nuclear fire.
So Cornelius, thank you for sharing sort of the domestic insight in Iran, because I think that that's important as part of this whole narrative. Before we turn to the US, I guess I'd like to ask both of you to comment on the degree to which you think that Iran's violations might be reversible moving forward.
Sure, I can start with that. I think that to date, all of the violations that Iran has taken, with the exception of some of the knowledge that it has gained from operating some of its more advanced centrifuges, which are machines that are used to enrich uranium, all of these are quickly reversible. And I think it's possible for Iran to roll back its actions, within that 3-month period. I mean, a lot of this is going to come down to political will. And if Iran wants to, feels incentivized to do so because of sanctions relief, I mean, 3 months is a reasonable period. I mean, what Iran will need to do during that time is, ship out its excess enriched uranium or blend it down, remove and store its advanced centrifuges. It needs to halt enrichment at a second site at Fordo. It would need to restore the monitoring and verification mechanisms, and it would need to roll back its enrichment to the very low reactor grade level that's permitted under the JCPOA. So again, all of this is reversible. And if we look at the knowledge that Iran gained, from operating these advanced centrifuges, while that itself cannot be reversed, I mean, this is really a very manageable risk. It's not a game changer in terms of assessing the value of the JCPOA, because the time period, was that these advanced centrifuges operated was short. Iran hasn't operated, a lot of them. So I think that's certainly manageable in the context of actually kind of reversing the deal, or reversing the violations to restore the deal. But as I said, if this temporary monitoring arrangement lasts too long, or if Iran continues to take more steps to produce uranium metal, which is something that Iran has begun to do, those activities, like I said, pose much more of a risk. I mean, uranium metal can be used for reactor fuel. That's what Iran says it's doing. It's going to produce fuel for one of its reactors. But it's also applicable to weapons development. And uranium metal production is not something that it appears that Iran did in large quantities or had mastered the technique of producing it when it had an organized weapons program pre-2003. So that's why, again, I think it's quite critical for the United States and Iran to move quickly to restore the deal, because if we wait too long, some of the non-proliferation benefits in the JCPOA, we're not going to be able to restore those.
Cornelius, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, just building on what Kelsey has said, the fact that Iran has reduced its commitment the way she has described can be taken as a signal that Iran actually wants to go back to the deal. I mean, it has taken steps that are in theory reversible, and it hasn't gone all the way to violating the confines of the nuclear deal. Footnote, that's different from the US sanction structure, which has been in place ever since the Trump administration has started maximum pressure. That's one of the things that people in Iran, and I'm not referring to government people necessarily, people on the streets in Iran do not see that anything has changed for them yet with a new president in the White House, because everything has stayed the same. Going back to government people, they will say, well, we need compensation for these sanctions. Just like we complain about knowledge gained on the Iranian side, the Iranians say we have made losses because we were put under sanctions willfully and unjustly, as they feel. So there is this debate about who has gained what during this period of mutual non-compliance. And the second thing is that with the movements in Iran on the domestic front, there is even a debate whether it's worthwhile for Iran to stay in the deal, obviously, but also to let the United States go back into the deal, just by a stroke of the pen. And that has to do with the snapback of sanctions, which the previous administration, US administration, announced to have triggered back in September last year. So a reactivation of all United Nations sanctions. The United States was the only country plus one of that opinion in the UN Security Council, so they couldn't convince others. But if and when the nuclear deal is fully reactivated, reinstated, the United States would surely have this instrument back at its disposal. And this is something which worries the Iranians, if we come to that point, that the United States might again misuse that instrument. So we cannot take it for granted that the Iranians will continue to make moves that allow us to go back to the deal. They have done so in the past. It may be different in the future.
So Cornelia, or Kelsey, did you want to add to that? It looked like you were about to say something.
I was, yes. Well, just building off of some of what Cornelius said too about, political space and how that may shift in the future. I would just note that some of these more troubling nuclear breaches that Iran has committed in 2021, these were a result of a law that was accelerated because of the assassination of Iranian nuclear scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. So I think that we wouldn't have seen some of these more serious violations happen, so quickly, had he not been assassinated. So again, that just comes into that just plays into the dynamic that, that individual, actions in this space could really also continue to shift the political space in Iran and Iran's political calculus about the value of the deal and restoring the deal and going forward. So I just note that because those types of things can add some uncertainty to the calculus.
So this actually tees up sort of a question that I had, and also several viewer questions that have been coming in. Joe Biden has made clear that he intends to bring the US back into the nuclear deal and to comply with the agreement as long as Iran does so as well. And Iran has indicated that it's ready to return, as both of you have described, as long as the US lifts its sanctions. But that seems like an oversimplified description of the exchange and of the next steps. And so I guess the question that I would have for you is whether it's realistic to sort of hammer out a deal within the next few months before June, because that's the window of opportunity that exists right now. And perhaps even more zugespitzt or more narrowly focused, a question that we have from one of our viewers is, are the Iranians prepared to make concessions on ballistic missiles and regional destabilization? If not, should the US even go back into the deal?
Because you brought up missiles with the last question and the question also in the chat from one of the viewers. I think there is a danger of conflating these issues, reconflating, I would like to say. The question about a return to the deal ought to be simple. This is about Iran reversing the steps that it has taken, and it is about the United States lifting the sanctions, those sanctions that have been added under the previous administration. So a fairly circumscribed, but a very difficult set of sanctions, no doubt. So this is the simple part. Two sides reversing the steps that they have taken over the past 2 or 3 years. The difficult part is the politics, the political part. It is the fact that, as we have said, that President Biden apparently does not feel like he can do this right now. I mean, he rejoined the Paris Climate Accord on day one. He reestablished ties with the WHO, with the World Health Organization during this pandemic on day one. What he did not do is do anything on Iran on day one. He could have, the most recent and first step, I would say, is that he rescinded the letter that the previous administration had sent to the UN Security Council about the snapback of the UN sanctions. So this is something he could have done on day one, just as a goodwill gesture, but he didn't do it. He may have wanted to assemble his team. He may have wanted to not take a step first before there is some sort of an arrangement. The scene is set, whatever. So this is the delicacy, the political delicacy of simply doing those easy steps. If we throw in missiles and regional conflagration, we won't get anywhere, not even before the summer, we won't get anywhere over the midterm, over the entire period of President Biden, I would say. There are specific reasons, and we can discuss this in detail, why missiles are very difficult for the Iranians to agree on anything. But for the moment, suffice to say that if we're looking at this short period of time until the summer, what we need is a kind of sequencing, a third party, a mediator, laying out the sequencing. How can both sides, Iran and the United States, come back into compliance so that they also can sell this face-savingly to their audience at home?
Kelsey, thank you, Cornelius. That was very helpful. And Kelsey, I'd like to bring you into this as well and pick up on that point that Cornelius just touched on of the sequencing, because my understanding was sort of the first step is to bring both parties back into compliance with the deal, but then to try to find ways to strengthen the agreement and to address some of the broader security concerns. That coming back to the 2015 deal is not going to be the be-all and end-all and solve all of these other open issues. It's a stepping stone in a longer process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Cornelius is absolutely right. I mean, there are, I think, domestic political calculations on both sides that have made both Rouhani and Biden feel like they can't necessarily make that first move. I mean, this is like being at a very awkward dance where everybody knows what they're supposed to do, but nobody really wants to be the first person kind of onto the dance floor, pressure and whatnot. So I think that I think that, of course, the political kind of interest is there. And I think the political interest is also there for negotiations that build on the JCPOA, once it's restored. I mean, and this is something that I think Biden has to continue to emphasize, both with supporters and critics of the JCPOA alike, because some of the most common criticisms of the nuclear deal that we continue to hear in the United States are that, elements of the deal expire over time, and that the deal didn't address, U.S. concerns about Iranian activities in the region and Iran's ballistic missile program. So if Biden continues to reiterate that the U.S. intention is to address these concerns in follow-on talks, then I think, that may also help create the political space in the United States to restore the JCPOA. And I think it was very important in Secretary of State Blinken's joint statement with the E3 foreign ministers that they now all appear to be on the same page on that approach, restore the deal and then build on it. And this is something that the Rouhani administration, I think, has left the door open to, and saying that, once the JCPOA is restored, we are willing to engage in a series of, negotiations. But the JCPOA kind of has to come first. And that makes sense because the United States' credibility took a serious blow by virtue of how the Trump administration, withdrew from the deal and reimposed sanctions. So I think setting the table with the JCPOA and then building on it, is a space that, all of the parties could return to down the road.
So I'd like to turn to sanctions a little bit and sort of unpack sanctions a little. But before we do that, I'd like to insert a viewer question. One of our viewers writes, do you see the US preemptively offering any concessions or sweeteners in the near term to Iran? For instance, might we see some non-oil related sanctions being eased, or the US advocating for the IMF to provide economic support to Iran?
I can take that. Well, advocating for an IMF loan would be a huge step. Not blocking an IMF loan would be a beginning and would be maybe more realistic. Again, a second word, preemptively. I don't see anything. The Biden administration is not in the mood to actually make a first step. So my presumption is that this will have to be choreographed, and then sanctions lifting, additional measures, humanitarian aid, and other elements can take place at a moment of the parties choosing, I would like to say, preferably before the June election. So in that sense, there is a lot that can be done. Unblocking money from international organizations, international financial institutions. The World Bank is another one which is there. Channeling humanitarian trade through a mechanism that the Europeans have set up 2 or 3 years ago, which has laid bare because of the maximum pressure campaign. Even a channel set up by 3 sovereign European governments is not immune to the pressure that comes from the Treasury and OFAC. This could be used because the Biden administration could signal that it is okay with using this channel, because this channel would also make sure that the money doesn't go into weapons purchases, illicit activities, etc. So it would be a humanitarian channel. In that sense, I would see this rather as things they put on the table now over those next 3 months, but not as sweeteners that come before there is some kind of an agreement.
Thank you. A lot of critics of the 2015 deal, both in the US, but also in Israel and throughout the Gulf region, fear that the Biden administration will lose its leverage over Iran if it quickly re-enters the agreement and drops sanctions. So, Kelsey, I'm wondering, what's your take on whether or not the Biden administration would be giving up any leverage that it has if it were to lift sanctions and return to compliance?
Yeah, I'm really glad you raised this question, Steve, because I think it's an important point. And I think there is a myth that's quite popular in Washington right now that the United States has all of this leverage because of the sanctions that Trump reimposed and the other sanctions that he added on top as part of his maximum pressure campaign. But sanctions only create leverage if they're paired with a credible off-ramp through diplomatic negotiations. And right now, the United States has zero credibility with Iran, and it has very little support for the sanctions because of the way these measures were put in place, in violation of a deal that had enjoyed international support and put on Iran when Iran was abiding by the terms of the accord. So I don't think that the United States has all of the leverage that critics of the JCPOA claim that it does have. But I actually think the United States will increase its leverage if it returns to the JCPOA. Because what we know about the first 2 years of the agreement, when it was fully implemented by all parties, was that Iran's economic growth, it grew, and there was, of course, investment in Iran. Companies went back into Iran, but it wasn't nearly to the level that Iranians wanted or that Rouhani had promised as a result of the JCPOA. And some of that is because U.S. primary sanctions on Iran, were not touched by the nuclear deal. So I think there's an understanding in Iran and an acknowledgement that to see the kind of growth and sort of economic reintegration that they want, foreign investment, they're going to need to sit down at some point with the United States and address and reach an agreement that lifts those primary sanctions. And that, I think, gives the United States, leverage. But the United States can only wield that leverage if it has credibility, and that credibility comes with returning to the JCPOA.
Cornelius, what are your thoughts about the effectiveness of sanctions and whether they actually do what they're supposed to do?
Well, the irony is that the sanctions have been more effective on European allies and on companies from Europe than they have been on Iranian companies. The entire, the kleptocratic part of the regime, which is benefiting of these sanctions. If ever you want to know about the unjustness of this world, you can look at the Rich Kids of Tehran website on Facebook, where the sons and daughters of the regime show off the wealth that their parents have gained. So that's the bleak side of the sanctions, that it seems to be hitting the wrong people. The other point I just wanted to make, Kelsey said the United States has zero credibility with Iran. Well, some might say, who cares? I mean, as long as we have enough pressure tools and we can, bend them to our will. But the United States under the previous administration has also lost credibility with the Arab allies, with the countries that are formally on the side of the United States. The most flagrant occasion was when presumably Iran-backed militias attacked the oil installations in Saudi Arabia and Abqaiq, and the then Secretary of State said, well, that's for Saudi Arabia to deal with. We don't feel compelled to do anything about this. And this has, sunk in Riyadh and in Abu Dhabi and in other capitals in the region. And, just to make the transition to your first question, it was also important for President Biden now with this, strike to show that he cares about allies in the region, and he doesn't, let such an attack go without response. And in that context, I know you wanted to come to the region at a later stage, but just to highlight this, I mean, the realignment that we have seen over the past years between the Arab countries, the Gulf states, and Israel has also its roots in a lack of trust on the Arab side in protection from the United States. They see the Israelis as being closer, as really sharing the interest of countering Iran, and of being also a protector of sorts, a weapons procurer for these states. So I think we have to look much closer to the region and not only see this in this very bipolar confrontation between the United States and Iran.
Thank you, Cornelius, because that's exactly the direction that I wanted to go in, to come back to the region as a whole and look at some of the regional rivalry. Both of you have talked a little bit about the compartmentalization or even tunnel vision of just looking at Iran through the lens of the nuclear deal. Obviously, a lot of Iran's neighbors are looking for a U.S. policy that tries to reduce some of the regional tensions. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been among those that have said that they have to be included in future negotiations over the Iran deal. But in some senses, it seems as if both of those countries have less interest in strengthening the deal and more in sustaining some enmity between the US and Iran. I guess I'd be interested in hearing from both of you. What's your take on the region as a whole? And we've heard a little bit about that from Cornelius already. But also, a number of questions have been coming in about Israel and the possibility of whether or not Israel might launch an attack on an Iranian nuclear facility. And if so, what the consequences of that might be. Do either of you want to sort of paint a picture of what's going on in the region? You're mute.
I'm happy to start and then let Kelsey add. Just because you mentioned Israel, I think this is a truly interesting point, not only because of the relations that I briefly touched upon, the newly established relations with Arab Gulf states and other countries in the region, but I mean also because Israel has an election coming up. I mean, let's not forget about that, which is much earlier than the one in Iran. Time-wise, quite precisely in the middle between the US presidential and the Iranian presidential election, by the way, but whatever that means. Also, in Israel, we do see a debate about the JCPOA and being beneficial or not for this country. It has always been a debate. I mean, we cannot take the Israeli government position as the only position in this that the country has. There have been former and active members of the government, of the military, of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, come out in favor of a renewal of the nuclear deal, because it's not so clear cut. I mean, Israel, and this is not just, people from America, from the United States or from Europe knowing it better or seemingly knowing it better. The argument was that the JCPOA is also in Israel's interest. Why? Because it confines, yes, for a limited period, but it does confine the Iranian nuclear program. The Israeli government at the time, which is still led by the same person these days, didn't see it that way. But it doesn't mean that there is not a debate underway in the country as to what the best course of action is. And so, with this election coming up, passing, and then probably having another period of government formation there, it'll be important to watch and to look for avenues how one can actually bring in Israel into this debate, not so much about the nuclear deal, the reinstatement of the nuclear deal, but about future regional talks. I think this is where really Israel should be sitting at the table.
And Kelsey, I guess, what's your take on how the Biden administration's policy on Iran ties in with its policy to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates?
Well, one point that I would make is that I think the Biden administration needs a regional non-proliferation strategy for the Middle East. Because when the United States looks at building on the nuclear deal, a longer-term framework to address Iran's nuclear program, I think that should be logically expanded to think about limitations on the region writ large. I mean, we're often laser focused on the nuclear program in Iran, and there's good reason for that. I don't deny, Iran had a nuclear weapons program in violation of its international obligations. It lied about it. There's reason to be concerned there. But if you look at what the Saudis are doing, for instance, they have extremely limited international safeguards and oversight. And there is evidence that they are trying to build up some of the capabilities that would be necessary for a nuclear program. And they're not doing it in a very transparent way. Furthermore, Saudi Arabia has openly threatened to pursue nuclear weapons in the past, to match Iran's capabilities. So when you look at the rise of interest in nuclear programs in the region, even those that are, clearly intended to be sort of peaceful programs, because of the dual uses of these technologies, I think it makes sense to think about what the principles for regional nuclear engagement look like from the Biden perspective. And I think that that's something that may then be more amenable to Iran as well. I mean, if Iran doesn't feel singled out for longer term restrictions and feels like these limitations then, capture any future nuclear threat or nuclear hedging by its neighbors, it may be more willing to engage in restrictions and limitations and discussions on that build on the JCPOA. And then, related to that, I think the United States, needs to think very carefully about how it pursues the ballistic missile question in the region. Now, in the United States, still, Iran's ballistic missile program is often tied still to its nuclear program. And I think conflating those two issues is problematic, because if you look at the trajectory of Iran's missile program, its focus on systems, under 2,000 kilometers, and its focus on precision, I mean, it's quite clear that Iran is developing these capabilities to counter regional adversaries. So this is about Iran's security in the region, particularly given the very advanced weaponry that other countries are able to purchase from the United States. So I think, trying to think about, again, ballistic missiles from a regional perspective, trying to support a regional dialogue on perhaps limiting ballistic missiles, that might be kind of far more feasible. And it might make more sense, again, because it could capture some of the more troubling ballistic missile developments we're seeing, in countries, like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, that have purchased ballistic missiles, from China and North Korea, respectively. So again, I think, thinking through those regional approaches and thinking where the United States could capture not just limits on Iran, but support, regional discussions to prevent any type of, nuclear hedging or destabilizing nuclear missile competition, would be a wise way to go. And Israel, I think, should realize that is in their best interest. And one last point that I'll make, because you mentioned at the end, just the possibility of an Israeli, military strike, and I think, it's just important just to say, quite clearly that, I think any military action against Iran's nuclear program would be more likely to drive Iran to pursue nuclear weapons outright, because it may feel the need to have that capability to defend against future attacks. So I view a military strike as only setting back Iran's nuclear program and then possibly incentivizing it to pursue the bomb. So I think it would be extremely counterproductive, and something that the United States should really push Israel not to pursue.
Thank you for adding that and touching on that point. Before we go back to Cornelius, though, I would like to push you a little bit on one thing. You talked a little bit about the need for this administration to really try to take a regional approach. And I guess the question I would have for you is, how do you sort of reconcile that need and the urgency with reporting that the Middle East is not a top priority for the Biden administration? And that comes despite the fact that the number 2 person at the State Department, Wendy Sherman, was a key negotiator of the Iran nuclear deal. So how do you try to reconcile those issues?
Well, I admit, as someone who's deeply interested in Iran diplomacy and preserving the JCPOA, I mean, I wish that they would, talk about, this being a top priority. I wish we would have seen action sooner from the Biden administration to restore the JCPOA. But I think, acknowledging that there are, I think we also have to acknowledge, though, that there are a number of urgent priorities that the Biden administration faces. And just realistically at this point, any of these, broader regional discussions, I think are more likely to take place, once we have a new administration in place in Iran. And that isn't going to be, until August. So I think, I certainly hope that it will still be a priority for the Biden administration. But I think there's also the recognition that, some of these longer term discussions, on the longer term framework for the nuclear program, supporting a regional dialogue, that this is kind of some time away, and therefore perhaps kind of less urgent than some of the areas that appear to be more of a priority now.
Thank you. So Cornelius, I know that you've been giving a lot of thought to Europe's role in all of this, and the fact that Europe appears to be somewhat absent when it comes to trying to develop the next steps to the Iran nuclear deal, despite the fact that it was the Europeans that invited the US back to the table. I guess one question I would have for you is where Iran policy sort of fits in to the transatlantic discussion right now, but also, and I think this is the bigger question, where can Europe take more of a lead in trying to address some of these issues, given the fact that the current US administration is focused heavily on domestic politics at the moment, that the Middle East is a little bit lower on the priority list when it comes to foreign policy issues. Are there opportunities for the Europeans, particularly the Germans, to take a greater role?
Yeah, well, great suggestion, obviously. And it's not like the Europeans don't have also domestic issues to deal with, but still, they've been fighting, well, tooth and nail in a very metaphorical sense only, to keep this deal alive. I mean, when the previous administration left, the previous US administration left the deal in 2018, few people would have bet on the JCPOA being alive for resuscitation 2.5 years later, or even 2 years and 3/4 later, because this is how long it took with the transition period and everything. So this was a major achievement, I would definitely say. If it hadn't been for the Europeans, not like they could do so much against, as I said, the pressure coming from the US administration, but they stubbornly refused to acknowledge that the deal was dead. And then Iran took only the steps, the careful steps that they took. So this is the one achievement. I would say that as soon as the presidential election in the United States went the way it went, and President Biden was confirmed, something, I don't know, something of a muscle memory must have set in with the Europeans. And they thought, okay, now we have to wait for what the new president wants. We have to wait until they come with their plans. It was okay to be against the previous policy, but when it comes to the rapprochement, which I definitely think is in the cards, it seems the Europeans lost, I don't know, the ideas, the courage, the imagination that they could have an active role to play. The irony is it was, for example, the Iranian foreign minister, Zarif, who suggested that the EU should be a mediator on these on the sequencing. It wasn't the EU proposing itself, which would be natural because it has an official function mandated by the UN Security Council to act as the guardian of the JCPOA, if you will, the convener of the Joint Commission, this body of signatories that is meeting. So it would be natural, and to answer your question, that the EU shepherds this process now over the next 2-3 months. Whether it will also be a driving force when we speak of, hopefully, the wider negotiations after the summer, I don't know. I think they can contribute ideas, again, proposals. How could regional organization look like? What topics? Non-proliferation is a burning issue, definitely. But there are other issues like maritime security, environmental protection, things that are less, less hot button issues in the region. And the EU could make suggestions. They could come with funding, which they have. It's in the budget anyway. It's just a question of directing it to these causes. So it can still play a useful role. But I think if we look at whatever we envisage as regional talks, both the United States and the EU should not be so visible. They should be on the sidelines supporting, but maybe the United Nations as an organization which is beyond the pale when it comes to political interest. I know there are many difficult issues inside the organization, but when you look at the type of reputation, I guess it's still intact to have the United Nations do this, because there is no regional organization which could be doing this. And so in that sense, this is where I see Europe's role in the midterm in supporting this regional talks, because the EU is built on regional integration itself. It's simply promoting the model that has worked for the European continent.
Kelsey, you're obviously watching what people in Washington are thinking, and do you have any sense of whether members of the new administration have any expectations of what Europe could do or might be able to do?
Well, I think that one thing that the Biden administration has made clear from the onset is that, restoring the transatlantic relationship, restoring, trust between the United States and Europe, and restoring coordination between the United States and Europe, is quite critical. What I would like to see the Biden administration do is recall that, in the period, after the JCPOA was fully implemented, the European Union actually began to engage with Iran on some of these other related issues. And to go back to look at that record to see what might be learned, where there might be interests of commonality, so they're not sort of reinventing the wheel. I absolutely agree, with what Cornelius was saying about, a natural kind of convening role around the JCPOA and other areas of interest. One that I would specifically, point to that I think, the Biden administration should, support Europe continuing to pursue is the great work that the EU has already, pursued with Iran on the question of nuclear security and nuclear safety. And that I think also could be a logical kind of regional extension of the nuclear deal once it's restored, where Europe could play, a very kind of critical role. Because as we see these nuclear programs emerge in the region, I think there are a lot of questions against, protections and security against nuclear terrorism, and a lot of concern about, risk mitigation in the event of an accident. This is an area where, Europe has, I think, a significant body of expertise and could potentially bring together some of these adversarial states to recognize that, acts of nuclear terrorism, nuclear accident, that would have a significant regional impact, and that there are, some logical places where these adversarial states, should cooperate in that space.
So as we start to wind down, I'd like to ask you both about outside actors. Earlier this week, we had a discussion on the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring, and one of the topics that came up was the destabilizing impact that other actors have had in the region over the last decade. And we've gotten a couple of questions that have come in about what the role of China and Russia might be in shaping the Iran policy moving forward. Do either of you have any thoughts on these non-regional actors and the role that they might play in the months ahead?
If I just start again briefly, maybe you're raising an important point, and that's one more reason for Europe and the United States to hold back if ever we come to this regional talks later on. Why? Because both China and Russia are today playing a very different role in the region than they did in the 2000s, up until the JCPOA was signed. Russia is now safely in Syria, with expanding its military presence in Syria. And China has inked a 25-year cooperation deal with Iran, which includes military cooperation, investments, etc., stretching out its Silk Road also in the Persian Gulf and through the land territory of Iran. So this is very much a different game now than it was, say, 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. They have still an interest in Iran not becoming a nuclear power. I mean, this hasn't changed. And this is the one thing that most parties can agree on. I guess all parties can agree on, plus Iran keeps saying that they don't want it anyway. So, they don't even disagree on this. So if this is where there is an agreement, then this ought to be the first priority. Once this is in the box again, one can talk about other issues. But yes, it's clear that the regional talks cannot be as easy for the Western side, if I can use that term, as they would have been 10, 20 years ago, which is another reason, again, why specific issues like non-proliferation that Kelsey has mentioned, nuclear safety, even maritime security, all countries are interested in having a safe passage through the Persian Gulf. regardless of the occasional threat to close the Strait of Hormuz. But this is where there can be an overlap of interest, including with China and Russia.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and I would add though too, if the United States and Europe are concerned about countering the rise in Chinese influence, restoring the JCPOA is a logical way to do that. I mean, right now, the manner in which the Trump administration, treated Iran under the JCPOA and, its maximum pressure campaign, I think, gave critics in Iran of the JCPOA, considerable, ammunition for, decrying the United States, arguing that the United States, cannot be trusted. And to a certain extent, Europe as well. I mean, we shouldn't forget that, Iran is also arguing right now that Europe is not, abiding by its commitments under the JCPOA, which I think is a stretch, and I think doesn't acknowledge kind of the Herculean efforts that Europe has made to try to preserve the deal. But still, it's the putting the JCPOA in jeopardy. Like I said, I think strengthened kind of anti-US, anti-European sentiment in Iran, and I think that continues to open the door for increased influence, by Russia and China. So if the United States in Europe, want to kind of counter that, provide more balance, then I think restoring the JCPOA is a natural road to do so.
So as you've both described, and as we've talked about over the last hour or so, there's a lot at stake when it comes to Iran policy. Let me ask you each the same final question, and for your final thoughts, what should we watch in the weeks and months ahead as this unfolds? Kelsey, why don't you go first?
I'll go first. I mean, I think, looking for an actual EU convened meeting of the JCPOA parties and the United States is, could be a very critical kind of first signal that the parties are beginning to engage on the process of restoring the JCPOA. And, while I think it's unlikely that we're going to see the Biden administration, issue any significant sanctions relief or, revoke the Trump administration's executive order withdrawing the United States from the JCPOA, I think we should also look for some small signals that indicate U.S. good faith intentions to return to the JCPOA. That could be, more efforts on the humanitarian side. That could be, waiving some sanctions for specific nuclear cooperation projects under the JCPOA that would allow Iran to return to compliance. I think, those small signals are what we need to look for right now. But to me, kind of the EU convened meeting would be the big step.
Thank you.
Well, just two very different things. One would be an article, possibly again in the Wall Street Journal, letting us know about secret negotiations between the United States and Iran that have taken place maybe in the run-up to that EU facilitated meeting. And the other issue, hoping we'll get there, is the Iranian election campaign. It's a very short campaign, usually only 4 to 6 weeks. But it's a window of opportunity for people to say things that they cannot say otherwise. The Iranian leadership places great value on people expressing their support for the Islamic Republic through participation in the vote. So they want to make this attractive, entertaining, if you like. So they allow for for freer expression of opinion than they would usually do. And this could give us an understanding of where Iranian society stands with regard to these issues. So in that sense, I would like to watch that too. But as I said, we're still 3 months away from that.
Well, there's a lot for us to follow in the weeks and months ahead. And I'd like to thank you both, Kelsey Davenport and Cornelius Adebahr, for sharing your insights and analysis with us today. I've learned a lot during the course of our conversation, and I really appreciate your taking the time to meet with members and friends of the ACG to have this important discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you to the ACG. Thanks, everyone, for joining.